uh, just try to summarize. I mean, I'm doing the same class in person also, so I'm not sure exactly where I stopped in the last class type thing. But I'll just try to summarize. We went through the history of early days before 1493 of race and the Inquisition and other things, and we briefly addressed about the Darwin and Mendelian revolution, which changed the thinking from climate-based race to genetic-based race. And then the measuring the skulls was very popular. And on the European side, a fellow named Blumenbach collected a lot of skulls and tried to make interpret racial basis on skulls. On the American side, there was a guy named Morton who did that, and so now we are approaching somewhere around like 1890. So now we are entering the 20th century where the whole word of eugenics was coined about. And as somebody who grew up, in former British India, it's always nice to pick on the Brits. So we get to pick on a guy named Francis Galton. And obviously, and this title of this talk is eugenics. So we're going to be talking about the so-called science of eugenics that took the whole world by the storm. I should say probably from 1890 onwards to 1945, or until the Holocaust, and then obviously people did a lot of soul searching, and it may shock you to say it hasn't quite ended yet. So I'll have a few slides to say about it afterwards. So this is the whole thing, that this was now there is obviously everybody knows the National Institute of Health, but there is also National Institute of Genomic Research. And just in 2021, they had held a whole symposium on the eugenics, the myth of eugenics. And so, but that's rather very long, and it gets into the very ethical discussion. So some of this material is borrowed from them. So these are the several myths that were created, that the Charles Darwin and George Mendel came up with eugenics. No, they had nothing to do with. In fact, Mendel was not involved in human genetics at all. And Darwin was pretty non-committal about it. He says, I don't know what to say. He just threw up his hands. I don't know whether there are 4 races or 32 races. And he was so there may be some difference, but he wasn't aware of genes as per se. And again, we always say that obviously this was all the bad guys in Germany did all this, but no, we shall see that this is the and the Brits, as they were ahead on a lot of things, that they were at the forefront of this. And anything that the Brits do, Americans do it on a much bigger scale and a more organized scale. So that was, so United States took the lead, and obviously, they had always struggling with the race since the onset of slavery. So, and again, said, okay, good old Protestant would not do that, because they just believe in the brotherhood of men. No, that wasn't quite true. Quite a few of these were clergymen type of thing. So, and again, now that we know the genetic code, we will avoid all the mistakes. No, that's not quite true. As we'll talk about it probably next week, as the book that some of you may have heard about, the book called The Bell Curve, which had a lot to do with, which got rightly criticized for associating intelligence with your skin color. So, but that will remain for next week. So these are some of the groundwork. Now, I understand some of you are physicians, some of you are scientists, but I'm not going to assume everybody has genetic background. So this is just like a few terms, that are genetics. Phenotype is what you look like from outside. Genotype is what you have on the inside, your genes. And allele is like same gene, but behave differently. Homozygote means you're exactly identical. Heterozygote means one copy. Dominant, recessive. Okay, dominant, we said about disease like, Huntington disease. Recessive is a sickle cell disease, So just to give you some idea that I may have used some of these terms as we go along further in the class. Now, obviously, this varieties of people had dabbled into writing things about race and science, and what this is, Now one has to chuckle that this was an economist. What does an economist have to do with races? But obviously, everybody thought they were self-styled experts and they had like a passing interest type of thing. So this was a book. He was an American and who wrote a book about the races of Europe, and he was become a racial anthropologist. And that book had a huge influence. Obviously, he was a proper Mayflower descendant type thing, and he was lamenting about the migrants that were pouring in from Middle Europe and Eastern Europe type of thing. So, and again, he was continuing with the same logic that was carried out based on scalp type. And he had classified, like people had classified, like Blumenbach had classified based on the long head versus short head type of thing. But he just went even one further and used the word Teutonic and Alpine and Mediterranean. So he did subclassification based on the region of Europe. And he again, and I didn't put a link, but he had written a very erudite article as early as 1908 in the Atlantic magazine about the thing is, and there are varieties of quotes from that. Race, properly speaking, is responsible for those peculiarities which are transmitted along the lines of direct descendants from father and son. And he just goes on and on about writing about varieties of things, about his lamenting about how many children these new immigrants are having. And he collects data from the Pennsylvania Germans as to how if a German marries another German, they'll have a 2.5 kids. While if a German marries a native-born American, they'll have a 2.3 kids. While if an American marries another American, they'll have just perfect balance, 2 kids. So he's looking at all the things, and he's talking about, and that some of the stuff that you read about, I mean, Britain has the white man's burden in India, while we have our own burden in Philippines and amongst the Negroes. Don't get offended by the words because I'm just directly quoting him. So and this was he had a huge influence on the writing. So he's sitting in comfortable America, classifying the European and lamenting about the problem that we are encountering. But he is hopeful that, these are all, after all, white people, so they will figure it out. He just totally ignores the others. Okay. Equally important book was another thing by a proper Boston Brahmin named Madison Grant, whose genealogy went back to, the Mayflower descendants. Okay, he was a scientist, founder of the Bronx Zoo, and was, again, quoted a big, well-influenced book about the passing of the great race, about the Nordic superiority. And he was also on the side, he was a conservationist about animal protection. So this was all climatic changes had imposed the elimination of the defective based on the hard winters and necessity of hard work and foresight to provide years worth of food. So this demand continued, produced a strong virile race. So again, they took the survival of the fittest and have it fit to their own preconceived notions. So the proto-Nordic humans were evolved in the forest in the plains of Eastern Germany, Poland, Russia. And so that's why they were the strongs. So now again, so these were the two and several, half a dozen other ones, which we'll talk about. But the pendulum was not quite on the other side, but there were a few people who said, hey, wait a minute, this is wrong. And an interesting person that, I don't know if Bruce has ever heard about him, but Felix Adler. He was a son of a rabbi, but he decided, okay, being a rabbi is not for me, and he became a non-believer, an atheist, and he had made a strong effort about creating representative from varieties of countries. The terminology that was in vogue was Orient and Occidental, okay, as to East versus West type of thing. And he had organized a strong universal race conferences between the so-called white and the so-called colored people to encourage a dialogue, understanding, and friendly relationship of ideas, the races of mankind, so to speak. So, but this was a noble thought, just before the onset of First World War, and and they had even established a New York Society of Ethical Culture and published a series of papers, scholarly papers on the matter. Okay, and to recommend individuals and races to be respectful and courteous to each other, and all civilizations have a lot of things to teach to each other. Okay, and so this was, a very noble attempt, but unfortunately, after the First World War, it just all more or less petered out. Okay, and at the same time, a couple of others, socialist people had attended a conference for dialogue for interracial dialogues that was held in New York, and all of them were, probably much more liberal-minded people, but they had invited one so-called colored person, and his thoughts were totally different. And you can read this quote type of thing, and this was from none other than Frederick Douglass. And as all of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with his work, and he had written a book called The Soul of the Black Folk, and his ideology was totally different from Booker T. Washington's. And Booker T. Washington did not want to make any waves, so to speak, but Frederick Douglass had taken a more stronger view that the problem is just mostly political, and until you get some political power. So his was much more antithesis of the two people. Now, again, remember, let's put this in proper context, that this goes back to at the same time in Europe, Pasteur and Lister had, discovered the germ theory. So again, as the Europeans started traveling to Africa and Orient or Asia, they saw the dirt and the filth and the communicable diseases. And so again, that gives us an idea that yes, that these are dirty people, so they need to be looked down upon. And it is our role to civilize them. And so the role of, rightly or wrongly, the scientific concept of infectious disease was incorporated into the racial thinking type thing. And this may make you cringe when you look at the ad, as the Pierce is a well-known soap brand, and you can just see how offensive this cartoon is. Okay, the middle one that you can see very well as to how a child, just washing himself with the soap turns lily white. And at the same time, the Pierce soap, the white man's burden. So, and again, one would think that this type of commercials had ended, but the well-known company Nivea also had started an ad campaign, probably directed at Iran and Middle East about, what idea of white is purity. And within 48 hours, they had a huge backlash of it, and they just quietly dropped the campaign. So again, the infectious disease research was incorporated in terms of mission to civilize, that it is our, so the dirt and filth and all the diseases. And then this goes back, this is not a new thinking. The plague was brought in by that's how the name, the Spanish flu, came in as to where it came from. It has always came from the next country, okay, type of thing. So how infectious disease was incorporated with, discriminating against the others. And one can say the founder of eugenics is the cousin of great Charles Darwin, a man named Francis Galton, and who I'm sure you have heard about it somewhere in the past. And he was a polymath in general, and he had done a lot of remarkable work in statistics and collecting data. Okay, and at the same time, he was big at cataloging. He would go around the streets of London and to classify women according to scales of beauty. And at the same time, this was goes around. You have to put that this was again towards the end of the Victorian era, and there was the cities were getting crowded. And hygiene was becoming a big issue, type of thing. So again, and he realized that yes, that the people who are the have-nots or the lower classes were having a lot more children. The upper classes were, marrying late and were having fewer children. So that's when he came up with the idea of good breeding, obviously extrapolated from botany and biology to humans. And again, some of these quotes are pretty, this thing, when desired information was acquired, then will be fit moment to proclaim a jihad. It's interesting to know that he was familiar with the word jihad, so it's not a new word. So obviously, and impaired the physical and the moral quantities of a race. So Eugene Galton, and he worked at the University College of London, and still until probably towards the end of Second World War, they had a Galton chair at the University College of London, and that has been quietly renamed as a chair professor. Instead of calling Galton professor, has been named now as a professor of genetics. So they quietly dropped his name. Okay, so he was, he had traveled to Africa and had also, on a side note, he had invented fingerprinting and measurement of, so he was big into multidisciplinary approach, so to speak. So, okay, and all right, so okay, and then that led to about 3 major eugenic conferences where also scientists, economists, politicians, literary people, they were all gathered with this conference of eugenics. The first one was held in London in 1912, and there were 3 conferences. The second one was held in the United States. So, and the last one was in 1930, not quite sure where. So this was one of the posters that was promoted. Okay, I think, I'm sorry, you're getting this, got it on this screen, aren't you? Oh, no, it's only on my scale. Okay, I said AI is making summary. So this was the eugenic tree as to how it incorporates data from various disciplines: biology, psychology, genealogy, sociology, medicine, and the self-direction of human evolution. So that incorporated the ideas that were prominent in botany and animal husbandry, and obviously I think if you Carl Zimmer is a well-known science writer in New York Times, and just about on my shelf behind it, you can't see it, but I'll show you that he had written a book about history of genetics and eugenics, and the book's title is catchy. She has her mother's laugh. So when his daughter was being built, that was as how people say, oh, he looks like his mom or dad. So that was the title of the book, and he starts out as to how this idea, as Mendel's ideas were lost to science for about 30 years, and they were rediscovered by a Dutch scientist named Hugo de Vries, and he had duplicated some of his work on heredity, and at the same time he had heard a self-taught botanist was working in California who was tremendously successful in breeding. And I'm sure if I say the name, you'll recognize his name was Burbank. So he was a self-taught man, and he was well known all over the world in his success in hybridization type thing. And so that's the city of Burbank. This name is named after him. Forget his first name type of thing. So, and so in fact, a lot of the European scientists, made a special trip to meet him. So again, we're digressing, but this tells you about, so this was the founding of the eugenics amongst various scholars of at that time. Okay, excuse me. All right, moving right along. And so so this is eugenics, the scientifically erroneous or immoral theory of racial improvement, plant breeding, getting popularity in the early centuries, so that you get the idea. Worldwide believed that they could perfect human balance. So it started out with a concept, but it was based on a rather weak foundation, so to speak. So because again, science was a lot more complicated than it would be, because we are fighting over, millions of years of human evolution. So again, so they decided to take varieties of steps, including voluntary or involuntary sterilization to breeding the bad germplasm out, okay, and reducing the reproduction of what they consider unfit. And as again it happens, the concept can get, okay. And these are some of the quotes of Galton, defined as a study of agencies which may improve racial qualities. So, and again, so initial idea was, that the right sort of class of people should have more children, and otherwise the so-called the working class and the Irish should be restricted. And all this was, and so the Mendelian logic, which was only valid for some heredity, that was extrapolated to a lot more complex human behavior and hereditary ideas. And again, this was by this time, Lunatic Asylum Act was passed in Britain in 1853. Okay, and again, a lot of the diseases were considered hereditary, which were epilepsy and feeble-mindedness. And again, this was at the height of the colonial empire. The empire was expanding dramatically, type thing. So, and so this was, Dalton's idea. So he collected data of varieties of people about the bleeding, and again, the whole foundation was rather, wobbly, to say the mind. And this is one of his books, Problems of the Feeble-Minded. This is Francis Galton, Fellow of the Royal Society, okay, with, who is who of British establishment, okay. And the same ideas were duplicated or enthusiastically embraced by a zoologist named Henry Herbert Goddard. And all of these people were well educated, and they had PhDs in either botany, zoology, psychology, and again, so and human behavior was classified in varieties of steps in mental development. So this was based on, from using the words which we no longer use, like morons and idiot and imbecile. And by this time, they were trying to find classification, and they had come across the classification that was used in the French education system by a guy named Binet, and the varieties of testing that was done, that was brought to the United States. And by this time, the people at Stanford were in work, and the IQ test, the so-called Stanford Binet IQ test, was used to classify the recruits for First World War. And again, they were sort of shocked with the results, because obviously a lot of the recruits were first-generation immigrants, who weren't quite aware of what the strategies of baseball was or what the popular culture was. And some of the questions were rather, depending upon cultures. And based on that, they were shocked. 40% of these recruits were, classified as, imbeciles or morons. So, and again, and another psychologist from Stanford named Louis Terman was, was heavily involved in the IQ testing. And another psychologist from Wisconsin named Yerkes was also actively involved in working with testing, not the schools, but other military recruits. Okay, and again, these are some of the more statements, of Galton in, in a late Victorian era. Okay, so but these are pretty self-explanatory. Again, putting it into a special social context, you can see this was, like, industrialization was in vogue, the poor laws were repealed, immigration was, widespread in not just from Europe, within Europe and from Europe, that thing. And again, there were a lot of battles for colony. The mad dash for Africa was taking place. So again, this was, the climate was just right for, they were afraid the people in power, and especially the Western Europeans, who had acquired large empire very easily, they were feeling threatened that could be replaced by the brown and black people very quickly. But again, just as I talked about in the United States, even on the British side, there were people who were raising red flags that this is wrong. And Josiah Wedgwood, one of Darwin's ancestors, okay, on his mother's side, okay, it said the eugenic societies, that these ideas were, not on solid foundation. So his objection was, so they were raising his objection based on individual liberty, At the same time, he not only just focused on the white upper class population, but he also supported, uh, the quote unquote Jewish race, and even to give him credit, even as far back as in late Victorian era, he was in supportive of Indian independence, which was far from thought from the establishment at Whitehall. Okay, now again on the other side, Middle Europe was no that was not too far behind. Okay, the father of this German race hygiene thought was scientist, physicians, with influential physician named Alfred Plotz, okay, who was, you can say he lived right through the Nazi era, okay, and he was believer in social Darwinism, and again, from being socialist, he quickly changed hats and became later joined the Nazi party, and so it was an about face, and so that's him, and you can see that created healthy parents with healthy children. This was the propaganda, and you also carry the burden. These are the earlier Nazi report. Okay. Okay, sorry, let me go back. Okay. Yeah. So the excellence of our race and the protection of the weak. And so he wrote the book as far back as 1895, and he coined the word racial hygiene in German, and he described eugenics ideas would be applied. And so he endorsed the so-called social Darwinism and genetic determination idea, obviously, and the evolutionary superiority of the German folk. Okay, so again, and so to examine the not just intellectual, but the moral capacity of the people to get married and have children. And so, in other words, prohibiting the reproduction of the unfit. Okay, and again, just kind of brought up the idea that disabled children would be euthanized at birth and should undergo examination at puberty to determine whether they should be permitted to marry and have children. Okay, and again, they wanted to establish a colony of the superior people somewhere in South America. So some of the ideas, were the preceded the Nazis coming to the power. Okay, and yeah, and okay, I'm sorry, there was a quote from him on which I think I seem to have misplaced, about now at the same time, that he was not an anti-Semist, his, at least in the beginning, he said, well, the Jews are maybe different, but they're certainly, some clever people. So he had written and in very glowing words of admiring the Jewish, diaspora that was there in, in Prussia and Germany at that time. But then again, obviously, he did a 180-degree turnabout when he saw who had come to the power. Now, again, so this was an interesting book. I think was published sometime in the 90s or so, how the Jews became white folks, that thing. And so this were some of the quotes from an Atlantic magazine article type of thing. So you can just read it yourself, that they historically considered an outside group and persecuted minority, they became one of the most successful and integrated group in American society. And so this idea is, so as to how the whole thinking changed. Okay, and there were other lesser known people who were also having their own thoughts. A person who most of you may not be familiar with was a guy named Ernest Renan. Okay, he was a Frenchman, Orientalist, and a language specialist, that is philologist, and he had traveled to the Middle East and was conversant in various Semitic languages, including Arabic and Turkish, and he had written varieties of books, including the most famous one was called Life of Jesus, and it went that so, and it became a very popular book, and even which he based on for whatever convoluted logic, where it said, well, Jesus was Aryan finally. So that was, and it became a very popular book as to how. So, and the Brits, I mean, normally they don't like French, but again, became Francopholic for his work, and his work was very popular. type thing. So he was one of the very first ones to the advanced theory of about the Aryan superiority. So so there were other people, because normally the French were not, strong believers in Darwinism, because Charles Lamarck's theory was very popular. It was still somewhat believed in France and even in South America or Brazil. Okay, so they were less enthusiastic about the eugenic movement than, say, Britain or Germany or United States were. Okay, all right. So, and so this is the whole idea as to how, the racial thinking changed. Okay, and so there are some. Now I had to look up into it, and this was a lecture that I came into. So this is done by I think probably an Israeli geneticist. So this was as to he encouraged the modern DNA analysis with the origin of Ashkenazi Jewish people. Okay, over the time frame. So from ancient. Now I think some of these names, some of you may be more familiar with it than I was, and this is I didn't define this term, but in genetics, there is something called the founder effect. I mean, it's a very small group of people are isolated, and if they have an abnormality, that could be, be amplified dramatically. So that's called the founder effect and the genetic bottleneck. So in other words, the same way, like a population of birds or even chimps can be isolated in a small area, that the gene that normally would not manifest its effects would show up. And the classical example would be Huntington's disease in a small island off the coast of Venezuela. And that's an interesting story it's by itself, that is how Huntington's disease was one of the first genetic molecular basis was identified by a enterprising researcher named Nancy Wexler, who traveled, her parents had the disease, and she herself wasn't, so she took it upon herself to go and research this tribe, in that small island, collected blood samples, brought them to MIT, and they after, and in those days doing genomic analysis was difficult because they had to use electrophoresis rather than just plug in a little cassette inside a Illumina machine. Okay, and getting answers, just with spit analysis. So this was a rather laborious way, but after a while, after collecting a few samples, within first few hundred, they got lucky, and they were able to isolate the genes for Huntington disease. So that is considered the founder's effect. Okay, so this is, so this is something that, has been discovered based on recent listing, that a lot of, and what their DNA genome analysis showed, that a small group of Jewish people had migrated around 800 current era to Northern Europe. And as human beings do, they had married local Italian women. So some of the DNA analysis showed components of both groups. Okay, and this is rather, let me see if I can zoom in and show this. Okay, the Middle Eastern origin, okay, then again migrated into Europe. And after that, they decided, they just kind of more or less married amongst the group. So these are some of the DNA migration that was traced. Okay, I'm sorry, let me go back to, okay, magnifying lens. Okay, expansion within Europe. Okay, this is migration to Europe. This one on the route. And this is fourth one is cut off. So this is, how the whole migration pattern took place. So this is the DNA component analysis that was done, and you can just see from this slide, okay, the Middle Eastern 15 to 45%, Italian 45 to 70%. Again, obviously that's European, and the percentage may vary depending, and the rest is, from elsewhere in Europe. So this is, some of the more recent data that I just stumbled upon this lecture. So I just thought that might be of interest. And again, so this, don't want to offend people, but this was an interesting as to how physiognomy or personal type has been stereotyped, as to the shape of the so-called Semitic nose. Okay, but again, it's not as clear cut. You can just see that the well-known actor Kirk Douglas, he did not have the nose. You can look at his nose shape. Okay, And the same way Ashley Montague, who will talk about him, he was a well-known scholar who had written a book on, later on, that we'll talk about later, I think. So you can just see how there is an overlap of shape. So one cannot just rely we cannot rely on based on skin shape. So the same way physical shapes and the skull shapes can be totally misleading, and there is a big gradation that takes place. Okay. And one would think that that has ended, but this is, may have recognized the recent movie, okay, about a Maestro. And again, the actor Bradley Cooper, he had worn, a makeup to make his nose look different. And so that was considered, and so that made the news about, stereotyping people, so to speak. So keeping appearance, it's the movie. I haven't seen the movie, but it's one of his, promotion site. Okay, the image of Jews with big noses have been associated with the anti-Semitism. Okay, and again, then the whole in the early 20th century, a whole branch of genetics genetics was based on a stronger mathematical basis by a well-known founder of statistics. And obviously, if you took even high school statistics or first-year college statistics, you may know the Pearson formula in statistics. He's the who is who of Carl Fisher and Pearson. The p-values. Okay, people, all the science basically swears by it. So this is the Carl Pearson again. So, but on the side notes, that is well known based on statistics as to who he was, who is who of statistics. But at the same time, he was a rabid anti-Semitic. Okay, you can see some of his quotes, that would make you cringe. Okay, and he was, well-respected English scholar or pop, and again, and his work through University College of London, okay, which was the headquarters, okay, and he was the first Galton professor at University College of London, and again, founder of the various statistical tools, so-called principal component analysis, and he had studied, not just mathematics but physics, German history, law, grammar, science. So again, so on one hand, these people were polymaths. On the other hand, they were virulently racist. And so again, these are some of the quotes. Here is one from Francis Galton. Okay. And here is another one from Carl Pearson. Badly defeated by a social, okay, will develop into parasitic race type thing. So again, so it wasn't just a black and white issue, but the racism extended to anybody who was different, as we talked about in the earlier class, between us versus them. Okay, so it had long roots and varieties of implications. So it had become not just confined to Britain, but it had traveled all across the world, basically. So Italy, Mexico, Canada, and even the Japanese were not, involved in. Okay, and obviously, this is not a class on Holocaust, but that we're all well aware of it as to how it became a horrible reason to kill innocent people, and not just Jewish, but the other minorities, including Romas and even other Germans. Okay, and anybody who was different, starting from the homosexual community. So there is, okay.
Bharat, Bruce
Yeah.
has a question.
Oh, please go ahead. I'm sorry, I couldn't. Yeah.
Okay, so Bharat, it seems so far that every time you mention a well-respected scientist, it's somebody that has confirmed what the society felt in general. They're just, as we talked before we started the lecture today, there are an awful lot of scientists that are already know what the answer is when they start to do their research. And I didn't keep a statistical count, but it just seemed like every time you brought up somebody who was well respected, they were just, in line with what the general population thinking was.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, no, it's like it's people had different hats, so to speak. On one hand, they could do work in mathematics, but on the other hand, it's just like, right now we are seeing how every Nobel laureate, has an opinion on subject which they don't know anything about. Okay. So, I mean, we are seeing that even nowadays, like some Nobel laureates would make, who has worked on, say, mathematics or physics or something, would have an opinion on vaccination. Okay. So, that somehow along the line, we have given, a lot more credence to certain things which are okay.
And
So
John's got his hand up.
oh yeah, John, yeah, I see that. Yeah, John, it just popped up on my screen. So yeah,
Yeah.
John, please go ahead. Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment. So, eugenics may be unethical, but it is scientifically sound. It is used. The term the other term we use for it is animal husbandry.
Oh yeah.
And it was used to to domesticate animals and also plants. So all the cows and the sheep and the chickens that we eat were done through eugenics, where the people selected traits that they wanted in their animals, and they literally killed the animals that had the traits they didn't want. It's called culling. So you cull the animals you don't want, and you breed the animals together traits that you do want. So eugenics is scientifically sound. It's just unethical when it's practiced on humans. And that's because humans are speciesists. That is, we think our species is above all others. So,
well, I think, and we'll get to that. I think I have a few slides about, how the prenatal testing that we are doing for Down syndrome, so that is, I mean, so that's the new eugenics, I have several slides for it, I think, just give me, hopefully I'll get to them later today, but I have the so-called based on, so that's what we are doing. So some of the newer genetics, it's not an easy answer type of thing. So I have several slides for it. So just give me time, see if I can, hopefully in the second hour, I can get to that, so those are the, I'm about 1/3 done. So I think in the third half, I have about half a dozen slides on that, which you and I know very well about, we exchange the ideas about the hearing thing. So I had to put that. He said, oh yeah, it's funny. I was just going to mention that in the slides, when you send me the link, about the genetics. So that really raises several, and I think, obviously you've seen how the protest came about from, the people who have children with Down syndrome, and at the same time, remember the movie Children of the Lesser God, as to how some people said, well, we don't want this to be cured, we're happy with what we have, type of thing. So there are some slides that I have, just give me some time and I will get to that hopefully later during the second half, Okay, no, thank you for bringing that up, John. I appreciate it. I think, and that's why I mentioned Luther Burbank, because until I started reading this, Siddharth Mukherjee's, and I wasn't aware of, because obviously I don't know botany history that much, but that was, he was selective breeder par excellence. I mean, but the who is who from Europe traveled to meet him. So, and the same way, there's an article about the feral pigs, in Canada. So there were British pigs very imported to Canada, and because they had more meat and an extra rib, but they are becoming, they're tearing up whole of Canada now. So, and they're vicious, even in the snow there. So this week's economist of the piece. So selective breeding can backfire. And Australians have had even a problem with, trying to do selective breeding. So there are huge examples how even animal husbandry can backfire on us, No, I think, so in all ways, invasive species, sometimes it could be beneficial, sometimes it can be done with good intention, but can backfire on us. Okay, I mean, Australians are a good example of it. Okay, so anyway, so thank you for, and first time I've seen, yeah, I understand that it's an old concept. Yes, Kevin, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, the whole thing was that in when we did the history of India class, or Britain and India class in 1857, the most ferocious fighters when the mutineers were attacking Delhi were the jihadis. They would have their green flag, green headgear, and they would fight until even though they were outnumbered and the Brits had machine guns, but they would fight till the end. So they had a toughest time trying to capture the gates of Delhi, the jihad. So that word goes back to even further back than this print, that the Brits were familiar with the word jihad, that was done during the 1857 mutiny. Okay, so I think so. The roots of jihad are, goes back further type of thing. So at least earlier that I recall, was reading about the, history of the Indian mutiny or the War of Independence, whatever you want to call it, type thing. And so that goes back further. Thank you. So we'll move along type of thing. And let me minimize this so you don't want to see it. Yeah. Hopefully the chat thing did not open up on your screen. And on the American side, there were 2 or 3 big names which need to be mentioned. The first one that comes to mind was a guy named Henry Goddard, who was a psychologist turned into eugenist. And he's the one who popularized the IQ test. And there was a school for the feeble-minded, in a small village in New Jersey. And there was a training school for the feeble-minded. And that's where all the people were, who were hard to look after or had any learning difficulties were given up. Okay. And again, he became the main advocate of intelligence testing in various social institutions such as hospitals, schools, legal system, military. Okay. And that was the starting out. Obviously, this follows right on the tails of Freud, and clinical psychology was becoming popular. And so this testing became, from so-called what we'd call special education, as became isolating this to feeble-minded. But the criteria were very loose and ill-defined, so to put it mildly. And anybody who was slightly different, and he had written a book called a so-called hypothetical Kallikak family about how the feeble-mindedness was heredited. He had said, well, one a well-known upper-class man had, an out of wedlock one-night affair, and the other side with some quote-unquote commoner, and her progeny on that side was huge amount of feeble-minded. And when he married a proper upper-class woman, all the people were, well-educated, lawyers, doctors, clergymen, and so forth. So that book by Henry Herbert Goddard. And so that was, you can just see it was written in 1916, and that became a very popular, and it made, even across the pond, and was incorporated in some of the Nazi propaganda. Oh, there is this well-known American scientist who has this worked out. Okay. And now some of the famous eugenic supporters, you may recognize their faces. Okay. Okay, starting from Roosevelt and to Winston Churchill, and and the middle person maybe not easily identified, but that's Helen Keller. And even though she had disability, she was still in favor of eugenics type of thing. But she made exceptions to the hearing of restricted people. So it was a strange turn of events. But again, you look at the other side, the names are who is who of from various fields, that Thomas, Alexander Bell, Clarence Darrow, GBS. Okay, so it was, it was not just a fringe, chain event by any means. Okay, and you can see some of the clocks, and Winston Churchill went even further. That fortunately his amendment that he had proposed, was voted down, because he proposed using the newly discovered Röntgen rays to sterilize men and women. Okay, but obviously, he was, and so, and compulsory sterilization was, included, nothing, but was again never did pass actually. Okay, and even as recently as the founder of the family planning, he had written an admiring letter. You can see how late it was, 1938, by Mary Stopes. Okay, to admiring, like they looked upon that the Germans were far ahead of the game, so to speak, so there was a grudging admiration from some of these people to what the Nazi Germany was doing. So the communication was, and admiration was going on both sides. And, and Winston was nothing wrong that was done to and quote unquote, red Indians and blacks of Australia. The stronger race has taken their place. Okay. And again, obviously, even other more established cultures, he did not look upon them. I hate the Chinese with slit eyes and pigtails. Okay. So he favored sterilization for alcoholics and other undesirable, so to speak. At the same time, one has to put it in balance. There are other people who are raising the red flag that this is totally wrong, such as people like H.G. Wells, another religious author who is well known to some of you, I'm sure, G.K. Chesterton. Okay, and so they were, questioning that this whole idea is totally wrong. Okay, and so and even, Beveridge, who was the founder of the National Health Service, was in favor of it. And on the American side, a well-known French immigrant named Alexis Carrel, okay, and he was one of the youngest person to win Nobel Prizes, for discovering new surgery for vascular, for blood vessel surgery, okay. And he had also, on the side, he had done experiments on keeping chicken cells alive, for the longest time to prolong life, so to speak. But that data was a little bit fudged, and they kept adding new nutrients, so that may have been a little over the top type of research. But again, like I said, Nobel laureates, he had again, dabbled into man the unknown. And he was a good friend of another eugenist named Charles Lindbergh. Okay, so the less dangerous criminals, should be kept in line. So this was his tome, as recently as 1935. And I'm sure that they were aware of what was going on in Nazi Germany, or in Germany by that time, some of the communication lines. So, but still they were not above advocating, literally killing, the so-called people with criminal tendencies and people who are going to be burdened on society, provided with suitable guests would allow this, would allow for the disposal in a humane and economic way. So when you look at it, it just makes you cringe as to how convoluted the thinking was. But again, to put things in proper balance, there were some people, several other scientists, well respected, were Thomas Morgan, the father of modern genetics, Nobel laureates later on, what again finally dissociated himself with this whole idea of eugenic moment. But again, and then he had moved to West Coast, okay, and he said, and he had again put things in proper perspective, that this is not all cut and dry as we would think, and at the same time, a well-known influencer, Walter Lippmann, was against this as well. So the thinking on that, is okay. And now even prestigious institutions such as Rockefeller Institute, had donated money and given grants to German science, and ERO, was Eugenic Relations Office, that was stops at Cold Spring, the harbor, and is still very much a pioneering institution for genetic research. And that was headed by none other than James Watson recently. Okay, he was the Nobel winner for DNA. Okay, and again, so this is, truly the so-called definition of scientific racism, the appropriate method of science to argue for superiority of white Europeans. So this was grew out of the ideas, which again, neither Darwin nor Mendel advocated this, but was extrapolated to with their own belief concept. And obviously, no talk on genetics is and history of eugenics is complete without I should have just started with this, the famous Supreme Court case, the Carrie Buck versus Bell. So this was the woman who was, had a harder time, had child out of wedlock, and then she was put as an orphan under care of another family, and she was raped by one of the family members and had another child and was institutionalized. And then again, when his daughter and mother were both institutionalized, and at the same time, the head of the school where she was stationed, okay, where wanted to compulsory her sterilized based on the appearance alone, that she had learning difficulty, and again, may survive in supervised thing, but she should be sterilized when she became childbearing age. And so the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and none other than Oliver Wendell Jones, 8-1 decision, was when case, yes. And the famous statement that you may have read about in some of the genetic testing, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So there was
Hello?
given, I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay, so this was, so we've seen more than once public welfare may be called upon. So this was the statement by him, during his opinion, that thing. So, okay, the principle sustained the compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting of fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this was the verdict that was handed out, I think. And again, we talked about the classification that was done, and Emma and illegitimate daughter Carrie were, okay, so she was raped in the, so it outlines all the things that we talked about. Okay, so, and you can just see how horrid the criteria they were given, shiftless, ignorant, worthless class of antisocial whites. Okay. Okay, so, but at the same time, when people who looked at her more carefully, she was
Bruce has
certainly.
a question.
Oh, please go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. Just raise it. Bruce, please speak up. Yeah.
Oh, this was the court case that Linda and I saw a play about
I
a couple
see.
years ago.
Yeah.
And the woman, it was a staged reading, so it wasn't a full-blown play. But at the very end of the play, this woman then started putting up on the screen newspaper headlines that we thought was going to end with, in 1927, that went all the way up through, 2000 and plus, that it just continues to this day. It's just better hidden about this concept in places in this country that sterilization and this process of deciding who should be able to continue to have children or not continues to this day.
Yeah, I think, even as recently as 2017 or 18 in some of the California prisons, this was carried out for some inmates of the prison and some, Hispanic women, that type of thing. So this was, as recently as you, so you're absolutely right that this was carried out, just recently, I think. And some of the well-known, African-American researchers have done some very good investigative work. And this symposium that I talked about by the National Genomic Institute, that was a 2-day symposium on the legacy of this. And these are the people. And some of these records have been very hard to gather as to who was actually the victim. There's one researcher who tried to gather data in Illinois, and he kept getting railroaded at this state, at the Illinois state office. So he finally had to go through a lot of work, and he did find research, and he did some original research as to how many people were, sterilized in Illinois. Okay, and California. I mean, I have a slide that's coming out about the graphs of all the states, the laws where. So there is a slide that I just it's coming down in a little while, I think. So I think we're coming up to 11 o'clock. So I think if you want to check.
Kevin's got his hand up, Farad, before
Oh
you.
yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, let's go ahead with the question. Oh
Yeah, some of you know that I had a sister who was Down syndrome, and Ann died 15 years ago, but she lived in a community with the majority of the young adults were Down syndrome. And this issue of sterilization kept coming up, and although it was considered, at least in Massachusetts, unethical to perform these sterilizations, if you wanted to, as a parent of one of those children, if you wanted to have a sterilization done, there are lots of doctors that would just, kind of wink at you and say, well, it's for her health, and perform the operation. This was well into the 2000s. As Bruce says, it didn't stop with, some legislation that still went on very frequently.
Oh yes, I think, and no, I think I trained in Louisville, Kentucky, and I knew some physicians. Oh yeah, I mean, they would just, during hysterectomy, they would just, or like
Right.
after labor and after cesarean section, they would just automatically type, oh, she's got so many kids, so they would just died. You know, they wouldn't know, but no asking type of thing. So
Well, the conventional uh, verbiage with Down syndrome young women was that, well, it's cruel to have to put them through the difficulties and discomfort of periods when they don't really sort of understand what's going on, which was hogwash. But that was the reasoning that was put down on a lot of medical reports.
Yeah, I think, you know, and you know, that's where the question about the ethical, you know, that's what the slide is coming out, that in Denmark, you know, with the prenatal testing, you know, well, because now you can, it's so easy type of thing. You don't have to do amniocentesis, you know, type of thing, you know, because my aunt who had, you know, I showed the picture of her granddaughter, and she got married at age 40 type of thing. And so she had undergone amniocentesis, which carries some risk. Nowadays, it's so easy. You can do fetal blood, which, you know, fetal cells are circulating in pregnant women's blood. So you could just do, you know, a blood test simply and do a DNA analysis, you know, on that and to find out about Downs. So based on that, you know, there was a big thing about in Denmark, everybody, you know, almost 99% of women choose termination. So Down's disease, Down syndrome would totally disappear in Denmark. How it will be in the United States, that the, you know, it's too early to say type of thing, you know, because it's United States is a lot more religious than Denmark is, you know, by many criteria. So that's going to be an interesting thing. So I have, you know, slides on that later on type of thing that becomes a very ethical things type thing. So okay, so I think let's take a 5 minutes break type of thing, and then we can we're fortunately I don't have too many videos, so I think I'm moving right along type of thing. So okay, so then we can get rid of all this non-pseudoscience and get into real science, you know, hopefully next time. Okay, I'll take a, you know, if you want to pause the recording for 5 minutes or something, you know, that thing. So okay, I think he has, yeah, he's, you know, okay. All right, so it's, I don't have a clock here. Oh, let me just see. I think it should be there somewhere. Yeah, it's 11:05, so we can meet in about 5 minutes or so. Okay, I'll get a sip of water and join you folks. Okay, all right. So I have the grid. So Kevin, I did cancel the class. I don't know if you were there earlier, so.
Oh, the one at Allegro?
Yeah, just for 5 people, including Linda,
Yeah.
who is familiar with, Zoom anyway. So I think, so it would be like 4 people.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
wasn't worth it, yeah.
probably a good idea. Yeah.
So I think, and that way I can, do, because I still,
Yeah, I was thinking that, we've been doing stuff at Allegro for a long time, but we had some way back that were not well attended, and that there were lots of complaints because there was no parking. And then Mary Kay Wells moved in, and she became the president of the Residents Association, something like that. And she was really responsible for getting Allegro to agree to set aside 20
oh yeah,
spots in
that,
the parking lot
mhm.
and have really nice facilities and refreshments and that kind of thing. So she was really very helpful. But now she's moved on from Allegro. She's moved to
Yeah.
I think
But
it's someplace on Bayshore
mhm.
that's less expensive. That
Right, yeah.
so I don't know how it's going to go there in the future, but it is
Yeah,
a nice facility.
Yeah, last time when we took the class, the parking was not a problem at all, but but
Yeah, that's because of Mary Kay. Yeah,
right. I think it was good because otherwise, it was a challenge. Yeah.
but that just started in January of last year, so that's only been available for about a year.
Okay. All right. So. No, hopefully, I think I'll be able to cover all the thing. I don't think I will need, but otherwise, I may just stick around, record the additional material and send it out as a separate link type of thing because.
Yeah, I've been trying to remember there was some class, I think it was a class I took, but one of the optional readings was a long history of IQ testing. And I'll have to try and dig that up. I don't know. You obviously didn't send it, but it was sort of fascinating because Benet's gotten a lot of bad raps, but his actual
Oh yeah, he was
very
yeah, but it
pure.
was just the whole thing. It was like, that he was trying to improve the educational system. I mean, I've read, a lot about, I think that is so controversial. There is a guy named Richard Heyer, who I think I have a few slides for next week about intelligence and testing and other things as to how it's considered a career ruining move.
Yeah, actually, Benet designed his test for testing of military inductees. That's how he started. And they have this test called the GCT test, which is basically the Army equivalent of an IQ test. And believe it or not, now, Bharat, I got out of the Army in September of 1970. And sometime in the last couple of months, I got one of these LinkedIn recruitment things that said, based on your GCT test score, we'd like you to consider becoming a consultant for us. That's, 53 years ago, 54 years ago that I got out of the Army.
Wow.
And I've gotten a lot stupider since then, I'll tell you that.
Oh, yeah.
But you presented so much better now, Kevin, than you did before. So
Yeah,
I'm not
did
so
you
sure
do
that's
it?
true.
Did,
What?
did you serve as a consultant?
I have no interest in going back to work, John. I retired, I guess it's 8 years ago now, and I'm I don't need to work for money, and I'm happy about that. And have no intention of doing that. I work for free.
I don't know if we talked about it in the brain class or not, but actually the more the people were putting in fMRI machines and were given the more difficult intellectual task type of thing. And you think, okay, the people who have a higher IQ, their brain would be working more, but no, actually it was working far less. So some of the fMRI data, type of thing was totally, opposite of what people would have expected, So
Yeah,
that's not
yeah.
when there was less
Well,
blue than yellow.
consulting is an interesting profession. One of my sons is a partner in a big consulting firm, and I conferred with him. He said there are 2 kinds of clients because you almost always get hired by a CEO or a very senior executive, and that person either there are 2 types. One that has a problem that they really don't know how to solve. They want you to help, but he said at least half of them are people that have a solution that they want you to gather proof for, so that they can convince their board or their bosses that they're right. And so that's the most lucrative part of consulting. But you have to make a decision early on whether you're going to accept those kind of assignments or not.
Yeah,
so is that what society is really all about? The people that are at some part are curious and some part just needs somebody to come along as a third party to substantiate where they want to go and what they believe?
Yeah, I think, like at our grade book thing, there was a guy whose name I won't say, but he was always every time he would mention confirmation bias, so he always
Yeah.
had to bring up confirmation bias in the discussion, Kevin
Yeah,
knows who I'm talking
Oh,
about.
he's a good friend of ours, yeah.
Oh, yes,
Um,
exactly.
Well, isn't there just a lot of that? There's been a lot of that throughout society.
Oh, absolutely.
but Bruce, going back to your original question, I used to belong to a thing called the Young Presidents Association or something like that. I don't remember what it was, but we used to have, meetings every quarter for 2 days. And I remember one, this is way back, because this is probably 30 years ago. They had a speaker who really resonated with me, and his point is that almost every president that he has met, despite the fact that what they look like and sound like from the outside, is that they have this, that I don't remember what he called it, but this feeling that why the hell did somebody ever think I should be president of this organization or any other? That they have this inferiority thing that said almost all presidents that he encountered have this, and I guess I would agree with him.
Okay, all right. I think we probably should get started if it's okay. And Al, if you are, I only see avatar of Al, so we can get started. I think hopefully. Oh yeah, there he is.
Yeah, you're running this yourself. There's no problem there.
Okay. No, I think we can start the recording. I don't see the recording. Oh yeah, my bar is on the other side, so we can start recording type of thing. So, okay, because there's no big gap type thing. So, okay, so. And this was the definition, this was interesting trivia to me, at least, that Oliver Wendell Holmes that we just talked about, at least. So he coined the word Boston Brahmin as to see. So obviously how the word Brahmin got incorporated into American English type thing. So, and so this is, and these are some of the links from the, for those who want to read more about, the Harvard's eugenics era, okay. And identified by its noble physiognomy, so an aptitude for learning, okay? So I think, at least I have the aptitude for learning. I don't know if I have noble physiognomy or not, so that, just, I think you guys can, I think I'm not going to touch that one type of thing. So, so this is, an interesting how, the empire, the history, and the linguistic, terms got translated, not just in British English, but also, and so this was the eugenic creed, Now this is a quote from another guy that we'll talk about, named Davenport, who is the, head of the Cold Spring Harbor laboratory for a number of years, and he was again, one of the, original founders, Mayflower descendant, and had a huge influence, not just in science or pseudoscience, but also in politics, And he was friendly with Reed Johnson Act, which was the Immigration Act that was passed in 1924. Okay, so he was quite friendly with this thing, and he was invited for, to give his opinion as an expert. Okay, and so these are some of his quotes here. You can just see as to how, he strongly advocated, that so-called positive eugenics and selective immigrants, right at the source, that those who are unfit should be prevented from entering the United States. Okay, so the policy became, compulsory sterilization, and as many as, almost several 100,000 people of feeble-minded were sterilized in 30 states had passed laws between 1910 and 1935. Sweden had sterilized 60,000. Canada, Norway, Finland, Estonia, Iceland, they all had passed the laws. And obviously the Germany went way beyond this thing, and not only just sterilizing, but murdering people, okay, type thing. So, and not just Jewish diaspora, but Jewish population, but also the psychiatric patients were gassed in order to free beds. And there's a 2-minute video clip of the Nazi propaganda, but the whole thing is in German. So when they give credit to Dr. Kallikak, Goddard's book. Okay, and I already showed you this slide earlier, so I think it should duplicate it type thing. So, and this was again made even the popular literature that in The Great Gatsby, Tom, it says, yeah, this is all worked out. The white race is in trouble type thing. All this is very scientific. So he just tells this to Nick type thing. So it even incorporated the popular literary works of at that time. Okay, so again, Henry Goddard, was again from a psychologist became a eugenist. So this is okay. And positive eugenics was incorporated. So you can just see how. So winners of the Fitter Family Contest, the Better Baby Contest. Then Indiana was the first one to pass laws. I think so. Okay, and we talked about Davenport. Okay, and this was heredity in relation to eugenics. I think so. Modern medicine is responsible for power of heredity. And so this was a very influential book, not just, for several decades. Okay. And again, how feeble-mindedness, was institutionalized. The famous writer Pearl Buck had a child when she was in China, and she was institutionalized. And it turns out that this was one of the hereditary disease, which later on became, the mother of a child continued pressing Dr. Felling to discover a test to see what, if anything, could be done for mental retardation. And this was one of the earliest disease that was, selectively testing was instituted, by the chemical test was done for the particular amino acid metabolism, which was responsible for causing mental retardation. Okay, and then subsequently, not just diagnosis, but later on, the dietary modification, which was if instituted earlier, can prevent the horrible consequences that occurs from this inborn errors of metabolism. So those are the earliest foundation of modern genetic medicine. So this was a PKU, and this was one of the first tests that was done on all newborns legally. Okay, and later on that battery of tests has been expanded to about different states have different rules. Some states do for 40 diseases, some do for 25, but PKU was the phenylketonuria was one of the earliest one that it was became mandatory to test all newborns, because the test was relatively simple and the yield was dramatic, because unless the diet changes are instituted right soon after birth, the deformities become permanent, and the mental retardation.
So
Okay.
Bharat,
Yes, go ahead.
what was the definition back then of feeble-mindedness? I mean, there's different types of learning. People have different skills, and it seems like this whole thing is geared towards the people that could who are articulate, who could, do certain kind of thinking. But then you look at people like artists or, auto engineers, or they're not going to fall into these categories, and they're going to be picked out as, oh, they're not the kind of people we want.
Yeah,
it's like these scientists are not taking into account the social science nature of how a society works and who's needed. It's like we just want to get a whole bunch of the brightest people around. And if they had been successful, I think they would have had a lot of people thinking and nobody able to do much.
No, that's why I think the recently thing, I'm sure you're familiar with the Howard Gardner's 6 types of intelligence type of thing. So, and there are varieties of, I think just for sake of time, I did not put a lot of this definitions type of thing, but there are several types of, there's another theory in psychology that is done for intelligence. That's an abbreviation that's done called CBT theory type of thing. I've forgotten what that initial stands for. But the one thing called Howard Gardner's was much more popular. Came onto vogue back, I should say, late 60s, early 70s. 6 or 7 different types of intelligence, emotional intelligence, this type of intelligence, like a physical dexterity intelligence. So So he classifies intelligence on different things, like, you may do fine on verbal skills, but you would be hopeless on mathematical. But somewhere along the line, just to say that, in the way this, the test was, this Binet test was, it has held to the test of time that, I've read a lot about, there's a guy that named I talked about named Richard Heyer, and I'm not sure, I think he's at Northwestern or something like that, so, and he still does a lot of the work type of thing, now, and there are varieties of interviews that if you're interested as to how he's talked about as to how, and he kind of grudgingly defends the bell curve and some of the work that was done by a psychologist who was criticized, named Howard Jensen, type of thing. So, but they're walking on eggshells when they do research type of thing, and some of the more recent work that is done is a guy that I think I may have mentioned earlier, maybe a guy named Robert Plomin, and he was a researcher in Texas, but again, he just thought this was too politically damaging to do research in US. So now he's working out of a place called Cambridge, UK. Okay, so but they still do some. No, they're doing a lot of work on so-called polygenic scores, but some of the data has withstood the test of the time of IQ testing in the standard this thing, and the Howard Gardner thing is the one that is a different way of different 6 types of intelligence. So that comes to mind. Okay. Okay, and there's another young lady also who has done some work type of thing, and you can find criticism from both sides. Some people who are strong believers, type of thing, they criticize this work, but other people have said, yeah, that there is some truth to this, of type of testing. Okay, so this is, answers about the Pearl Burke. So this was one of the earliest, prototype diseases of inborn errors of metabolism. And this is the graph that I talked about earlier, as you can see, as to laws in effect, January 35 states with laws bills pending. So this was the graph that was there for various states, how they had different rules, that were passed for, a total number of surgeries that were done, 20,000 type thing. So this was one of the graphs for sterilization rules. And California was way ahead on the curves type of thing. And, and again, other people who are not, quote unquote scientists were also strong supporters, Kellogg, who was an industrialist, he had written a book about good health, and again, he was, raised into, it was into agriculture, but again, they were extrapolating some of these ideas into how it applies to humans and future families, and and John Harvey Kellogg, so eugenist, promoter of physical fitness, vegetarianism. It influenced numerous movements, including the one for pure food, pure drugs, public health, personal hygiene, exercise. Okay, so so it had a wide-ranging support, and this was one of the cartoons that was in a magazine which may be defunct now called Puck, about how the big industrialist, trying to keep the undesirables away. Okay, but the interesting part was in their own background, their background was also working class, but they conveniently forgot this type of thing, as to and again, as early as, before the eugenics movement even took off, the 3 Harvard recent graduates had founded the Immigration Restriction League, as early as 1894, I think so. So the Harvard was kind of, big into the center of the eugenic movement. Okay, and I compared, the who is who of establishment of Harvard, Charles Eliot, Lawrence Lowell, and this is for those of you, I think I strongly suggest that, I think for sake of time, I'm not going to click on this link, but again, their own magazines, have really, this are like 2 or 3 page articles, but if you're interested, read it, click into this link type of thing, because just for sake of time, I'm not going to go through the whole listing, but if you're interested, look into this, as to their own looking into it. Okay, and Harry, and then another one person that we didn't mention besides Davenport and Goddard were a guy named Harry Laughlin, who was hired by Davenport as a director of the Cold Spring Harbor Library. And he did, study of eugenic sterilization in the United States. Okay. The New Jersey rejected the law, but 18 states had passed the law based on the model by 1924. Okay. And again, we talked about another psychologist named Harvard, whose name Lothrop Stoddard, who was again a PhD. He had titled 1920 bestseller, "The Rising Tide of Color Against the White Word Supremacy." And it was popular, went through 14 printings. Okay, lavish praise from President Harding this time. And again, so that I mentioned about the, appearance in The Great Gatsby. And there was Princeton.
Bharat,
Yes, please go ahead.
hi, Bharat. Every time you keep mentioning Great Gatsby and Cold Spring Harbor, I grew up on Long Island. Cold Spring Harbor is notorious in Long Island. It's way out in the middle of Long Island. It housed for many, many years the Russian embassy, and there were all sorts of houses there that were crazy things went on. I just find this very humorous. And Great Gatsby was in Great Neck, actually, and Sands Point, which was right around where I grew up. And it's just very funny how clandestine that whole area is. And you just don't, Cold Spring Harbor has no government or anything like that. It's all run by agencies and things that are there very secretly working. And I just find it very humorous. So that's just a social side note.
But they had, they hold big conferences even now. Some of the genetics conferences that are held. I mean, it's like the who is who of American genetics. Would gather there, and I think if I'm not mistaken, Barbara McClintock did research over there too. Barbara McClintock was, like a pioneering geneticist, and James Watson was the head of the Cold Springs Harbor Laboratory for decades.
So bizarre.
Yeah, exactly. But some of this military establishment, type of thing, so like, especially the military intelligence, like in one of my other classes, we talked about, the phage research, and the military has a lot of the secret this thing that you would not even know. Some of the indiscreet buildings, type of thing. Like
Bharat, I lived about 200 yards from Cold Spring Harbor for 3 years, and it's not quite as bad as Leah's points, but there's a lot of truth in what Leah said. It's a very strange.
They actually threw the embassy out of Cold Spring Harbor during when everybody was going after the Russians and locking up their money and all just a couple of years ago. And I heard the embassy is no longer there, but
No.
It just adds a little color to this story and the secretiveness of it.
Yeah, I think actually it was a consulate. But
what is their funding? I don't know what their funding is now, because obviously I don't know if the Rockefeller Institute still funds them, or the federal government funds them, or what do they funding? Because they're not affiliated with any university per se, are they? And I have to look it up. I think so, but obviously, but still.
I think a lot of their funding came from the Department of Defense, which could mean
I see.
An institute, a well-known institution in Langley, Virginia.
Yes, that I can gather that. Yeah. So, and again, like how much research MIT was doing for military type of thing, and they still do type of thing. So that's like it's been a big it's like I think I was not too far off about the military industrial educational complex, so to speak. Okay, and on the Princeton side, there are a couple of names. He was a psychology professor named Carl Brigham. Okay, he had published a book on study of American intelligence. Now, and again, the conclusion was foregone. The Nordic race is far intellectually superior to blacks and even Jews. I mean, that gets to me type of thing. Says who won the Nobel Prizes more? Like 2% of people have won 25% of Nobel Prizes. So that just okay. And and he was the one who created the scholastic aptitude test, by the way. So just for trivia, okay. Another botanist named Edward East, who was a racial version of eugenics. His book Inbreeding and Outbreeding: The Genetic and Sociological Significance. He warned that race mixing would diminish the white race. and have risen as a distinct mental capacity in their physical trait. Okay, so this was again, so these people were, what one would not expect, but they were dramatically okay. Yeah, and this was, like this was not Tucker Carlson that said that, but Charles Davenport, who we just mentioned earlier. Okay, I think so. Okay, and this was, I just found this a few days ago type of thing. So this was a conflicting poems, obviously the one on the left, all know very well, but the one on the right may just come as a shock to you, or I don't think too many of you would have heard this, type thing. So as to, you can just read the summary, which is, hopefully it's very easily readable. And not being a poetry fan, I don't know who Mr. Thomas Aldrich was, but obviously, he had his own Scythians. Okay, so now how they got into the picture type of thing, and the Slavs flying overwards, poverty and scorn, oh, liberty, white goddess, is it well to leave the gates unguarded, so, okay. Okay, so this was, can we build a wall high enough, so this is again, so this is, history repeats itself, it's not just 2020, but 1920. Okay, so I just found this slide a few days ago type of thing, so, okay. So the American youth, it's Charles Davenport, and we talked about Alexei Carroll, this is, I'm sorry, I tried to this thing, and so this is, okay, now we'll go on to the other things, about the political side. The Chinese Exclusion Act, that was passed, how the kicking off the ladder, okay, the Johnson-Reed Act, okay, and this was summary, the guarded gate, kept out the thousands of, hundreds of thousands of people out of America. Okay, and this was an interesting story. This, I just found this a few days ago while looking through this, that 18-year-old man, who was, turned back on the infamous ship Spirit of St. Louis when he was 18, okay, and was sent back to Germany, okay, but was luckily able to escape from Germany to France, and was able to enter the United States, and then after going to night school, managed to get, PhD and became professor of genetics at University of Washington. Okay, and he's the founder of pharmacogenetics, which is the way to see what genetic defect you have as to how you would metabolize certain drugs. And the physicians amongst you would know that it's well known that there's an enzyme in the liver called cytochrome 450. If you have abnormalities with that, you would not metabolize certain drugs more effectively, that thing. So, it's well known to, if you say like you would not metabolize blood thinners or antiplatelet drugs, called Plavix. And he was, and some of his students have outshone him. The well-known person named Joseph Goldstein. Okay, Goldstein was the one who got the Nobel Prize for LDL metabolism. I think I should say probably 1982 or something. Okay, so they discovered the LDL receptors, so there was the Nobel laureates that changed the whole thinking on cholesterol treatment, so based on the LDL receptors, the anti-cholesterol drug, the statins, were discovered and dramatically changed the history of cardiac disease. Mary Kay King was the enterprising woman who isolated the BRCA gene, the breast cancer gene. Okay, so she was his student at University of Washington. And this was the, a book about the voyage of the damned, as to how the ship that brought a lot of Jewish people and others who were escaping the Nazi persecution, that was turned back. So you can read, that's a reference to that. And that is Dr. Arno Matulski. So it's an interesting story as to, and he was and then he was originally supposed to come to Cuba, but did not allow refugees to disembark. And again, the United States refused them entry. So did Canada and other nations. So it had to go back to Germany. Okay, and again, a few countries accepted, type of thing. So it was England, France, Belgium, Netherlands. So Dr. Arno's family was sent to Belgium in 1939. Okay, and then luckily he was able to escape, and make way later on to United States. Okay, via France. okay, and and was and no finished his schooling in Chicago later on, okay, and so these are and some of the admiration, that mutual admiration that went on from California to Germany. So they certainly thought that this was, and the German propaganda, so they, copied the United States. We are not alone. The German word said, so type of thing. And, they displayed, well, all the other European countries are doing the thing, so we can't be too far off. So as to how they use that in their own propaganda machine type thing. So, okay. In American foreigners' histories, so Nuremberg laws were based on Jim Crow, second-class citizenship, third Nuremberg law, the American laws about interracial marriages, okay, and we talked about the Loving versus Virginia as to how they were arrested when they returned to Virginia based on breaking the interracial marriage laws, okay, and again, in the U.S. we were a lot more strict. We had the one drop rule, okay, type thing. But the Germans were at least say, well, this was too much even for them. So they just say, if you're 1/4, then that was the whole this thing. So, and that just backfired on a lot of researchers who were very devout patriotic type thing, And the classic example would be Fritz Haber, who was Jewish, but at the same time he was devout patriotic and on one hand, he discovered the ammonia process and saved, solved the food production all over the world. On the other hand, he was the one who discovered all the gas warfare, as a patriotic German. Says, I'm a patriotic, the scientist has to fight for fatherland. Okay, and so that was one of the things. And again, Hitler praised the Madison Grant book that we mentioned earlier is my Bible. So we can just see how, and the word, so conquest of the American West was taken as a role model for decimation of, getting the living space. Okay, so the routes were, traveled easily across the Atlantic, I think so. And again, the hereditary laws were passed. So this again, very well known type thing. And the word was created, lives unworthy of life. Okay, those suffer, and they just went to all sorts of mental illnesses, schizophrenia, epilepsy, dementia, encephalitis. Okay, and those are so these were some of the rules that so the ties were extensive between the two. So, and I think just read some of this, and a lot of that is well known in to people who have read extensively about Holocaust. So, okay. And again, the prestigious journals were not about it, See, okay, Bruce, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to add to your list of people that the Nazis went after. If you've been to the Holocaust Museum over in St. Pete, they also went after the gypsies.
Oh yeah,
they went after the people that were involved in the Church of the Latter-day Saints. They just literally had their list of, they're not like us, so we're going to get rid of them sort of lists.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it wasn't just mental, it was also other characteristics that
yeah.
Nazis went after.
The criteria is very, yeah, absolutely. And also anybody over the communists, anybody who was even suspected to have communist ties, the Bolsheviks, so they were they were a huge number, and they were German citizens, and they were, the huge number of Bolsheviks were eliminated,
And also what I find interesting, that after World War II, the folks in the US were more afraid of communism than Nazism, and the number of Nazis that they brought into this country.
Oh yes, I think
because they were anti-communist.
Yep.
Nazis that were involved in, the camps and other high-level positions.
Oh, yes. So there's I don't know if you're aware of, we talked about in the bomb, the class on Manhattan project we did, Operation Paperclip, okay, which were all the scientists, who were captured, no matter they were party members, so we got to grab them and have them work for me type of thing, work for us. So that was considered Operation Paperclip. Okay.
Well, there's a large number of Nazis that ended up in the middle of New Jersey. That's where they dumped a lot of them, which is also a place where a lot of Jews ended up that escaped from Germany. So it's sort of like one town over, We don't want to go over there because they might kill us, sort of thing.
There was a thing about that in my class. I had the little, lyric that Tom Lehrer had about Werner, the father of the atomic bomb. So Tom Lehrer had a skit, type of thing in the 1970s that I had played in that one of the classes. I just build the bomb. I don't care where they land. As long as they go up, I don't care where they come down. So there was a Tom Lehrer skit. Okay, I'm sure you probably have heard about it, or at least some of you may have heard about it. Tom Lehrer was a great, he had things about the new math as well as for the Tom father of the atomic project, the German scientist, So back in the 70s, I think you can find out. I'll try to find it for you, if you're interested. It was a nice 2-minute clip, where he plays on the piano about this thing. So. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how it came upon him, but it was a nice this thing. I'm sure a lot of you have, will remember him very well. So this is the prestigious New England Journal, and this is as recently as 1934. So they were, and even this 100 years later, they hadn't changed dramatically. So this was one of the old things. This was the previous name of what became New England Journal of Medicine. Again, so they just said, this is. Are allowed to marry, this is not going to come out well. So even 100 years later, they hadn't changed to their thinking, So, and again, and this was some photographer who had a daring or a great sense of humor. A photo contest in Germany, 1935, before the law. The most beautiful Aryan baby. Turns out she was Hesse Levinson. She was born of Jewish parents. Okay, so he just thought whether she could get away with it, and he did, And she was, again, it's amazing how much information one can find, which is, and she eventually, came to the US and, worked on AP chemistry exam for. So this is, like I said, okay, well, you see if you can tell the difference. Wanted to make the Nazis look ridiculous, the son in the house, Sone in his house. So that was her. Okay, and I'm sorry, some of these slices, and this was, okay, and we talked about Ashley Montague, who was, now I think, at least, growing up in India, I probably know Ashley more about Ashley Montague because he was one of the, diplomat or civil servant in British Empire, Ashley Montague. Okay, and he was again, instrumental in one of the commissions to see whether to give home rule to India or not. Montague Chelmsford. So he had traveled in the 1930s or so to India. Okay, and this was in 1942, a book, The Fallacy of Race. And this was during the heydays, and because he obviously was aware of it, and Way had written a book about the fallacy of race, so he was probably a voice in the wilderness. And again, by this time, then later on, it took about 30 years for more scientific basis, and again, obviously the chemists, the biochemists know very well, and the protein research and other stuff, they started a little later than that, with Linus Pauling. Okay, so, and again, I'll talk a little bit about it when we talk about David Reich, that thing. But this was groundbreaking work by Ashley Montague. Okay, and again, this was the statement of the race. After the Holocaust, this was the statement by the United Nations, statement of race from 1950. Okay, the mental capacity of all races is similar. No biological causes of hybridization. Okay, and if anything, like mixing, improves the genetic, this thing with the hybridization that we talked about, type of thing. And okay, I'm sorry, just go back further. Okay, and again, so one would think that this has ended after Second World War type of thing, but no, there are subtle people with strong agenda type thing. There is a very fringe magazine called Mankind Quarterly. Okay, and that was sponsored by British psychologist Reginald Gates, U.S. person, and it's funded by businessman out of Kentucky. He was inherited the southern wealth, a guy named Wycliffe Draper, and he had funded a lot of research, and something called the Pioneer Fund that he has. He's a rich Southerner, and he has single-handedly funded a lot of this research, and he gives research to people who, fulfill this thing about the racial superiority, and this is the issue, and so and they still trying to give a legitimate, credence to this type of research. Okay, and they're funded, including the one that I talked about, Howard Jensen. His funding was from this Draper Fund, and the books that I sent out. The researcher an English reporter named Angela Saini, who had done research on Superior. So she talks at length about. She has done a very good investigating research as to how the funding can be traced back to the Pioneer Fund. And even though Draper has died, but still, the funding is, has decreased somewhat, but has not totally disappeared, Okay. Okay, so there's still, a lot of things to give sort of labels. Yes, no, we are trying to show. And this is, again, I don't know what Harvard this thing has, but this is a Harvard anthropologist, this is as recently as 1962, okay, had written this about the so-called multicentric origin, type of thing. So this is, so again, so there are fringe elements that still are writing some of these works type of thing, okay, arguing against the scientific basis for white supremacy, okay, and continued racial segregation, okay. And this was made to be a required reading for high school students in Louisiana, okay. But obviously the major establishment, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, they again said we had nothing to do with it, type of thing. And okay, so there are some elements, who are still, holding on. And again, we talked about Louis Agassiz, who was the Swiss, anthropologist, zoologist, and he was the big name at Stanford. And finally, Stanford is trying to separate his legacy, so this was, okay. And so these are the varieties of research, so this is not just United States, but there are other countries have also, been involved in it, including Sweden, okay. And this is last but not the least, Philip Larkin. So this was his poem that I just thought he would throw in, so those of you who are the poetry fans, so your mom and dad, that they can mess you up type of thing, but that's Philip Larkin for you, okay. So I just thought that thing and okay, yeah, I think we still have a few minutes, so we will go through. I think I'm running surprisingly on time, okay. And this is, I've read both of his book, and this is the book that we talked about briefly. I think Kevin researched this and had put this name, and this is a very well, written for layperson by David Reich, who has a big lab at Harvard and has done a lot of DNA sampling from different areas of the world, not just United States, not just in Northern European population, but all across the United States. And he has collaborated a lot with other Indian geneticists, and has classified the North and South Indian diaspora genomic analysis. And again, he had to walk on this ground due to the Hindu, superior policy of the current Modi government. But again, the conclusion there was genomics of inequality. So again, he had taken, this were respectable samples, not huge, but again, 5,000. Okay, that in the self-described Africans, that 1/4 of them had European ancestry. So one cannot rely quite on, as to whether they could get cystic fibrosis just easily, because if they're unlucky, so it just, one cannot just go based on the physical appearances, so this is, one of the things, and the genomics and the clusters, and we talked about the so-called founder effect, type of thing. So, so this is, like thousands of people, in Turkey and even in Middle East, can have a so-called Genghis Khan gene, Okay, so this is, so some of his works was how the peopling of Europe, and and the other subcontinent India. So that is, he has some varieties of graphs that I think I might have slides of that later on. Okay, and now again, the eugenics, has again, you would think that it has not, we alluded to earlier, the non-invasive prenatal testing. Okay, so just from circulating blood, it's very easy to establish, at least the major chromosomal abnormalities, and the fetal DNA can be circulated. And again, obviously, we have come a long way since the early days of Huntington's disease gene, that, it's remarkably cheap. The cost has gone down so dramatically for next generation sequences, like companies like Illumina, that it is from the human genome analysis, cost $3 billion, but now it can be done, the whole DNA analysis can be done in the field type of thing. And a company called Oxford Nanopore, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the other classes for Nobel Prizes, have done, like based on just a USB stick, you could do the DNA analysis in the field, So that was one of the Wellcome company funding, so they devised the thing called Oxford Nanopore technology. So these are the varieties of advances that it faced, and okay, let's see what we have. Okay, and again, so this, one would think that the genetics would have ended. No, this was a fringe effort done by another, the when rich people have their own agendas type of thing. So the eyeglass tycoon named Robert Graham, he started the so-called Genius Factory, and so again, trying to breed, selective breeding, and the crazy Nobel laureates, who got the Nobel Prize for the shared Nobel Prize 1/3 for transistors, named guy named William Shockley, and he had donated his own, sperm for breeding. So this was the so-called, and never panned out to anything, because again, it's like we can just see that sometimes what happens, that breeding, it's like something called return to the mean, so to speak. So again, just because two smart people have this thing does not necessarily mean that a kid would be even more smart than them. So sometimes regression to the mean that takes place. And so this was one of the fringe efforts that took place, type of thing. So a lot of people, that this thing, but after his death. But again, the as to genetics, has its role type of thing. So, and this was, and I'm sure some of you I may have mentioned this, that one of the rabbis, in New York area, had 4 or 5 children with Tay-Sachs disease. So he had started the organization, Dor Yeshorim, to trace for recessive genetic disorders in the Jewish community in the Northeast area. And, we are, and with maintaining the privacy, the screening is carried out. And if they do have recessive elements, then they're advised either adoption or in vitro fertilization type of things for screening. So, and they've been remarkably successful, that they have not had any incidence of Tay-Sachs disease since they started the screening process, so-called classical matchmaking process that is done before people decide to have children. Okay, and couple. So, and they've been remarkably successful in preventing, hereditary diseases type of thing. So that is, you can just see as to how, screening can be useful. On the other hand, when we cross the border, amongst the Pakistani and even various Saudi Arabian communities, people marry their first cousins. And in Bradford, this was the data from Bradford, which is a huge Pakistani British population. Only 4% of births are responsible for 30% autosomal recessive diseases. And you can just see then, so they're not distinguishing here, but most of them are Pakistani, this thing. So you can just see the incidence of abnormalities is dramatically high, compared to non-South Asian. Okay, so this is, the diseases which would not manifest themselves, are becoming a big problem. And Saudi Arabia is spending a lot of money trying to do the genetic screening and treatment as thing, but okay. And again, so now the 3-parent IVF, for the so-called mitochondrial diseases, the UK has allowed, this type of gene replacement therapy because mitochondrial DNA is relatively small, and some of those abnormalities that can be in the mitochondrial gene can be dramatically serious and fatal. So this is the so-called three-parent IVF type of thing as to how, the in vitro screening is done, and selectively, IVF is carried out. Okay, I think, and again, with marriage among these two women who got married, and they had the sperm donation, and unluckily the donor had a serious liver enzyme abnormalities, and so they had started a company called the New Eugenics Company to look for variant diseases. So this is Lee Silver and Morris had started a company as to see screen for disease, because sometimes, obviously you're not screened that effectively, when you're a sperm donor. So this was one of their business enterprises. So this is the new eugenics. So it's like you can see the science has changed dramatically. So we already talked about David Frost. And again, another guy that you may recognize the name, he was, the rich billionaires, had their own ideas. So hope to seed the human race with his DNA. So this was, I haven't looked too much into it, but this was, obviously the source is reliable type of thing. So he had his own ideas before he got into trouble. Okay. Last but not the least, but with the sperm, I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just looked up the Bradford Safeguarding Children Board, and they look to be awfully Anglo-Saxon white types, and they gave an award to 27 individuals, and most of these individuals look to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant types also. So I suspect a
Actually,
little
there's been a
racism there too.
resistance. Yeah. I've read a little bit about it that amongst the Pakistani communities, and I said, oh yeah, look, we have 6 children, 5 are normal. So what are you all fussing about, So there is still, they get the resistance because property and other stuff they have done, their hard practices are very, they are not very receptive to accepting the ideas, type of thing. So I mean, I've seen, I think, a BBC documentary on it, and when the counselors went to them, yeah, look, I have 5 kids, they're all normal. So I said, like, so this is so we've been doing this for hundreds of years, we've gotten away with it, so it's just, and I think the number, if they have less children, they may get away with it type of thing. So, but I think when they were having 10 or 15 kids, that's when the problem became more apparent. Yeah, so, and again, so it depends upon, sometimes, it's a lottery type thing, and there is, John may disagree with it, but a lot of it is randomness, so to speak, so type thing. So, okay. So this is, again, with the sperm donors type of thing. So this is a strange conference as to how 44 siblings had a family reunion, type of thing. So this is, they're searching for one another type of thing. So, and again, there was a case, I think sometime in Indiana, some physician or a gynecologist was using his own sperm. So he had fathered almost like 240 kids or something like that, So it was, the regulation is lacking in this thing. So, okay, and I think so. So we are getting to and again, obviously the human cloning is obviously, it's been banned in a lot of countries type of thing. But again, I would not be surprised if somebody in China is working on it secretly. And again, we talked about in the genetics class about the scientist who was initially praised for eliminating the HIV gene, the CCR5 gene, and had done the genetic, the germline gene editing with CRISPR. And initially he was considered as a hero. He's a unique one in China. And when a lot of the Western scientists at the Hong Kong conference criticized him, he was saying, oh, no, he did it without our permission. And he was put in isolation in prison for about 2 or 3 years type of thing. So that was a story that was in 2018. And I know there's been a lot of stuff written about it in the CRISPR things, I think so. Okay. And again, going back further, John and I just talked about, just a couple of days ago, gene editing that was done for birth-related deafness type of thing but again, it's going to be a very expensive technology and a very selective few type of thing. And I would not be surprised. And the same way, we were talking about we talk about the movie Children of Lesser God as to how the young woman who absolutely does not want to learn how to speak, she was happy with her sign language, okay, type thing. And there were protests at that time, even with the cochlear implant type of thing when it came out back about 30, 40 years ago, from the deaf community says, oh, we are happy with the way we got. We are more related to other deaf people than my own biological parents. And the same way, some of the people with achondroplasia, which is the genetic short stature, they want to make sure that their kids, they would prefer, we're happy with being short people type of thing. So there's a lot of, pushback from the people with this thing. And the same way we talked earlier a little bit about the Down syndrome type of thing. So genetics, has a lot of this thing. So the chapter is not closed on eugenics in the positive way yet, and we still have a lot of, and obviously I'm not an ethicist, but I'll leave it to our friend Ron Hammerly and the other experts type thing. And there's, and I think I have some talks about, another geneticist, who was the old-fashioned geneticist from Stanford named Luigi Scarfosa. Is a long Italian name. And he was collecting samples on various small communities and either in Amazon or various islands. And again, and he had, being a geneticist, can say, oh, we are not racist. But again, when he talked to the ethicist lawyer, guy who has done a lot of work at Stanford, guy named Henry Greeley, he counseled them that yes, that you are going to meet protest from the indigenous communities type of thing. So you cannot go around like the old days that give them a few beads and and mirrors and say they're going to be happy and give you blood samples. So they had a rude awakening that this is what you're doing in 1990 is what you did in 1930 is a no-no for 1990. And so that was one of the things about how the scientists themselves had to come to reality. And the same thing that went on with the early days of genomics also, the conference that was done in California in 1970. So it's an interesting history about how scientists can be totally naive in terms of research. So I think we have come around, we have finished most of the slides on eugenics, and I'll stop here and okay, and we'll continue next time. We will talk more about the more of the science based on race and color, and there's some of the medical aspects that are involved. Okay, all right.